Racist cop intimidated an elderly black woman in her home, but they didn't know who her son was. If you're new to this channel, I invite you to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any amazing news stories here. Mary is a 75-year-old woman. She is black and her skin shows the signs of time and the difficulties she has faced in life. She has arrived in a wealthy neighborhood in the United States. Her move, which may seem surprising to those who see it from afar, is an important moment in her life. The neighborhood had wide streets, lots of trees, and large houses. It seemed on the face of it a calm and safe place. White fences, well-kept gardens, and walls that showed wealth formed a beautiful backdrop, looking like a painting. But behind this perfect appearance, there was a cold climate full of prejudice. The neighbors watched her arrive with suspicious glances. Mary's movements as she packed her things were watched carefully through the windows. Low comments and whispers could be heard in the houses nearby. Some people even looked through the curtains. They hid their bad thinking behind fake smiles. They pretended to be normal when they saw her. That sunny afternoon, as Mary settled down, the quiet of the neighborhood was interrupted only by the sound of a few passing cars. But the place, which was supposed to be peaceful, had something disturbing about it. Mary felt she was being watched. She sensed a bad energy in the atmosphere. The reason for the hidden prejudice to appear more strongly was the robbery that had taken place a few days before their arrival. A house was robbed. Expensive jewelry and money went missing. For many of the neighbors, the situation was easy to understand and very bad. A black woman who had just arrived was in town at the same time as the robbery. For them, Mary couldn't be blameless. It was as if the color of her skin and where she came from showed that she was guilty. Mary just wanted peace in her new phase of life. But without realizing it, she was in the middle of an unfair situation that made her look guilty for a crime she didn't do. People living nearby started talking to each other. Who is this woman? Where did she come from? What does she keep? The questions came, not out of a desire to know, but out of fear. Mary suffered from racist assumptions. Over time, the gossip changed to accusations. At first, these accusations were discreet, but they were about to come out in force at any moment. People's mistrust grew stronger, like a storm that could hit at any moment. Mary, despite being used to people looking at her with judgment throughout her life, felt the weight of the situation in a different way. She did nothing to be suspicious of, but she knew that racism sometimes didn't need a reason other than being alive. Even so, she kept a respectable attitude. She continued to tend her garden. She watered the flowers she had planted with love, hoping to make that place her home. But inside her, Mary knew that the place where she lived was not a good place to fulfill her dream of peace and quiet. The prejudice in the hearts of her neighbors was a force that no one could see, but it was very strong. The situation seemed to get worse every day. The air seemed full of tension, as if it would burst at any moment. Mary felt more alone, but she wouldn't let fear rule her. She had been through a lot in her life. It wouldn't be this new situation, full of mean words and looks, that would make her give up. A black woman whom no one knew and who was alone had just moved into the neighborhood. For many people there, his presence alone was reason to be suspicious. Prejudice against people of other races, coupled with the rush to find someone to blame, led to a story of accusation that wasn't right. And so, without any clear proof, the gossip spread quickly. It was the new neighbor. Mary had to be connected to the robbery. The gossip was everywhere. How did she manage to move to such an expensive neighborhood? The phrase, "she seems to be hiding something," was repeated many times. The prejudice that had always existed in people was now becoming stronger. This was because of fear and the desire to maintain what they thought was a standard of safety in the neighborhood. The gossip, which had previously been just secret conversations, soon reached the authorities. Someone made an unidentified complaint to the police. The report said that Mary was the culprit in the robbery. An unsubstantiated claim said that she kept jewelry and stolen items in her house. They also said that she was involved in the smuggling of prohibited products. For the local authorities, this was enough to decide on swift action. In the prejudiced opinion of some of the officers, Mary was seen as guilty only because of the color of her skin. They felt that her presence in that wealthy neighborhood was unacceptable. Mary was paying attention to the garden. She didn't know that, just a few minutes away, a police car was passing through the neat streets of the neighborhood, heading for her house. The sound of sirens in the distance didn't worry her. She had no reason to be afraid. I never thought I was about to suffer a violent and unjust attack. When the police cars arrived, the doors opened quickly. The police came out very aggressively. There were no questions and no talking. Just carry out. Mary, unaware of what was happening, saw the officers approaching. Before she could speak, one of the officers pushed her hard. The world seemed to move as Mary fell to the ground, hitting the stones in the garden. The pain came quickly and was severe. Her arm, which is weak from age, broke on impact. She tried to support herself to get up, but the pain and the impact were too strong. The neighbors looked on from their homes. Some were shocked, while others, like Michelle, were happy with what they saw. Michelle, a fair-skinned lady who lived in the same street, couldn't hide her spiteful joy. Across the street, she smiled a lot and started applauding the policemen, as if they were doing something very important. For her, seeing Mary being treated like a thug was proof of her own prejudiced ideas. At that moment, Michelle saw the justice she wanted so much, but which in reality was far from fair. Mary was crying with pain. She felt confused and helpless. With a bruised arm and a bruised body, he tried to understand what was going on. The police officer's speeches seemed like a shower of accusations that made no sense. They asked, "Where are the jewels that were stolen? And where do you hide things that are forbidden?" Mary tried to speak. She was scared and in pain. Her voice came out with difficulty. "I don't understand what they're saying." "I didn't do anything," she said several times, almost begging them to believe her. But the police didn't want to listen. For them, Mary was already to blame. Her word didn't matter. At that moment, the justice system that had to take care of her showed once again that it didn't work. It was blinded by the racism that is in many parts of society. The image was very strong and sad. The police showed that they didn't care about anything. They didn't think twice and showed no compassion for the elderly, injured woman in front of them. To these people, Mary was just another person to be controlled. To them, she had no importance or dignity. The only reason for this was the color of her skin. The violence was not only in their actions, but also in the words they spoke, as if they were sharp knives. "Where are the jewels?" "We know you hid them," shouted one of the policemen, his voice full of pride and certainty for no reason. Mary, still taken aback, tried to respond, but the pain prevented her from making any sense. I don't know what they're talking about," she said between sobs and labored breaths. All around, the neighborhood watched. Some people, afraid, looked on from afar, not daring to help. But there were people who, like Michelle, felt a bad sense of satisfaction at seeing the scene. From her balcony, Michelle looked intently at the elderly woman on the ground and smiled mischievously. Her clapping echoed in the uncomfortable silence of the street, like a veiled approval of the violence committed. For Michelle, seeing Mary treated so cruelly only showed the prejudice she had already experienced since her black neighbor arrived in the neighborhood. But in that difficult moment, someone she knew came along and brought comfort. Her son, Scott, came running when he saw the commotion in front of his mother's house. Seeing his mother on the ground, injured and surrounded by police officers, made him very angry. Scott was a big, strong man. At that moment, he wasn't just a worried son. He was also a judge and upheld the law. He knew very well what justice was. There was nothing fair about what he saw in front of him. He ran quickly to the policeman. His voice echoed down the street. "What are you doing to my mother?" "That's incredible. You can't treat her like this," he shouted with a lot of anger in his voice. For the police, Scott was just another problem that needed to be solved. They didn't care who he was. To them, he was just another black man who had the courage to doubt their power. Questioning their authority resulted in swift punishment. "Get out of the way or you'll be arrested for disobedience," one of the policemen said, moving towards Scott in a threatening manner. But Scott, filled with rage at seeing his mother in such pain, didn't give up. "You're going to have to pay for this," he shouted, coming closer to the policeman. That's what changed everything. Quickly and violently, the police grabbed him, throwing him to the ground with great force, just as they had done to Mary a short time before. The sound of punches being thrown was loud in the street as Scott was beaten. He couldn't protect himself. The police, unable to turn back, decided to take Mary and Scott to the police station. The two of them were arrested in handcuffs, as if they were bandits, while the neighbors looked on without saying anything. Scott sat in the back of the police car. His mother was next to him. They were both bruised, both in body and heart, but they were determined. At that moment, everything seemed to have collapsed around them, but a new struggle was beginning. Inside the dark, hot police car, Mary and Scott were together. However, the pain they felt was far greater than the bruises they had. Mary's body shook with every movement, her arm, broken and still aching. The sadness in her eyes was clear. When they arrived at the police station, they took Mary out of the car violently, even though she was frail. She had difficulty walking, but the officers didn't seem to care about her pain. Scott, for his part, was pulled out, his hands still bound, feeling every movement with the weight of his bruised body. When they entered, they were taken to a small room. They would wait there before being officially registered. The place was freezing, not just because of the weather, but because there was no one around. Mary struggled to sit down. Her face showed that she was in pain, both in her body and in her heart. She looked at her son. The look on his face was very sad. It seemed that the whole weight of her life had come together in that moment of shame. Seeing her like that, Scott felt his heart tighten. Then one of the policemen, a man with a serious manner and a voice full of pride, entered the room. He looked at Scott with contempt. The smile of derision was on his face. "So, big hero? Do you think you'll get out of this?" he asked, leaning across the table. Scott, despite the pain he was feeling, looked up. His eyes were full of anger. "You don't know who you're talking to," said Scott, his voice strong but full of restrained anger. He understood that this moment was very important. He couldn't get too nervous. He couldn't let his anger get in the way. He had to be smart because he knew that if he showed who he really was, the situation could change. "I'm the most important judge in this state," he said, speaking slowly, as if his words were cutting through the air. The policeman paused for a moment. He looked less confident in his smile. He moved a little to the side as if trying to understand the information. "What is it?" he asked a little doubtfully, while the other policemen in the room began to look at each other uncertainly. Scott spoke in a firm, controlled manner. "I'm Judge Scott Almeida. You have just made the biggest mistake of your lives." At that moment, the air in the room became very different. The arrogance that had been present before was now replaced by a strong tension. The policemen looked at each other. Fear slowly began to show on their faces. They knew Scott Almeida. He wasn't just a normal citizen. He was a man who could change their lives. What they had so violently done to him and his mother without knowing who he was now left them in a situation of total despair. The policeman in front, who had previously shown that he was strong and secure, took a step back. He couldn't speak. He knew that anything he said now could make the situation worse. The silence that followed was very strong. It seemed as if the news had taken all the air out of the place. Mary, who had been silent before, looked at her son. She felt proud and relieved, but also very sad. She knew that Scott didn't like to show his strength and that he didn't want to use his power for nothing. But at that moment, he had no choice. "I have proof of everything," said Scott, speaking firmly as if to make sure. "You don't stand a chance. You'll all have to bear the consequences of what you've done." The policemen didn't move. Fear was beginning to creep into their heads and the tension was spreading like a disease. Scott stood firm. "You will be investigated, all of you. I will see that justice is done." The effect of those words was very strong. The policemen, who a few minutes earlier had seen Mary and Scott as thugs, now looked timid. They were afraid of what they had done. They understood that there was no escape. Reality was in front of them. With that, they were sure that their professions and their lives were going to fall apart. But Scott and Mary's struggle was far from over. They were taken to the cells where Mary would remain until the hearing, despite Scott's attempts to intervene. But the police didn't know that Scott was just getting started. He had already made people feel unsafe and afraid. And with the strength he had, he wasn't going to stop until he made everyone who hurt his mother pay for what they had done. Scott understood that he would need to use all the tools he had to make justice win. He had a surprise in store, a powerful piece of evidence that could change everything. The security cameras that were in Mary's house. Scott had planned every detail of his mother's home security when she moved in. Knowing the dangers she could encounter, especially in such a wealthy and prejudiced place, he decided to place hidden but well-functioning cameras around the house. The cameras were placed in important places. They filmed not only the front garden, but also the area around the house. This way, one could observe any strange movements. He had insisted that Mary accept, and now that choice seemed like a good thing. Sitting in prison, still feeling pain from the beatings he had taken, Scott began to think about what he would do next. Did you know that the cameras recorded everything about the police abuse? That was from the time the officers arrived until the moment your mother was pushed to the ground and you were beaten too. That evidence would be more important than any testimony. Without it, they would only have your words against those of the police. Scott understood how things worked. He knew that in cases like this, the word of authority was usually stronger. However, with the recordings he would know the truth completely. Images that could not be denied. They would show the judge and everyone else the unwarranted violence and open racism that his mother and he had experienced. Scott thought that this could be the last action against those who misused power. When he had the chance, Scott asked to speak to his lawyer. He understood the justice system well and knew he needed to make quick decisions. The evidence on the recordings was a glimmer of hope, and every moment counted. His lawyer, who was also surprised by what had happened, said he would go to Mary's house straight away. He wanted to get the images from the security cameras and get everything ready for the trial. Scott's plan was working, but at that very moment, something dark was appearing outside Scott and Mary's prison. The police officers, who had previously been arrogant and abused their power, began to understand what they were up against. The discovery that Scott was an important judge made everyone afraid. When they realized that the cameras could have filmed everything, their fear grew. They knew that if the photos were revealed, their professions and even their freedoms could be in danger. Inside the police station, the atmosphere among the officers changed. They huddled together and spoke nervously. They knew that if they didn't do something soon, their lives could be ruined. One of the officers, who had commanded the attack on Scott and Mary, called an urgent meeting. "We have to sort this out before these images go to court," he said, his voice low but full of haste. They understood that they couldn't rely on luck or use excuses. The images were going to show the truth. The only way to escape the future that was shaping up was to put an end to the evidence. At night, the cops who weren't honest made a plan. They were going to hire 2 men. These men were known for doing risky jobs very carefully. The task was to break into Mary's house and throw away all the evidence. It wasn't just about destroying the cameras. It was also important to take the devices that held the recordings with the images. If they managed to get rid of this evidence, they might be able to escape from the prison that was coming. The plan involved a lot of risk, but for them, it was the only choice. The leader of the group, a man with a cold, calculating gaze, knew that time was against them. He said, "We don't have a choice," in a low voice, but full of haste. "We need to stop these recordings, or we'll hurt ourselves." The other policemen, nervous and worried, agreed. They all knew that Scott's security system was advanced, but not impossible to shut down. They still had one last solution: hire 2 trusted men. These men were people who were used to doing difficult jobs without being discovered. These men, who are good at doing illegal things, were called in that very night. They had been called in for this kind of work before. When they received the assignment, they carefully made a plan. They would enter Mary's house at night when the neighborhood was very quiet, and they would need to do everything quickly. The objective was obvious: to break the cameras and, even more importantly, to take the devices that recorded the images that could cause problems. With the details decided, the 2 men set off on their mission. The street where Mary lived was quiet. The lights in the houses were off. The curtains were closed, as if to hide not only the people who lived there, but also the bad mysteries of the place. When the invaders arrived at the house, they heard the wind blowing lightly through the branches of the trees. It gave an impression of calm that wasn't real. They set to work without a second thought. The security cameras outside were the first places hit. Using specific tools, they quickly disconnected the devices. They knew for sure where the cameras were, because they had received information from the rogue police officers. They carefully cut the wires. They broke the lenses and made sure they were all completely destroyed. The front of Mary's house, which had previously seemed safe, was now bare. But the hardest work was yet to come. The intruders understood that the recordings weren't just on the cameras. The data was stored in recording devices that were hidden inside the house. The challenge was to find and remove these devices. They entered the house quickly and quietly. The place was dark and quiet. It seemed that even the walls knew something bad was going to happen. The men looked everywhere. They looked in drawers and cupboards. They tried to hide any sign that they had been there. Finally, they found what they were looking for: the recording device. They quickly unplugged the devices and put everything in their backpacks. This way, they took all the evidence that could harm the police. It wasn't just an ordinary break-in, it was about getting to the bottom of the truth. The silence of the neighborhood was interrupted only by the quick footsteps of the invaders leaving the house. They were carrying Scott and Mary's only chance to show the injustice they had suffered. As the 2 men disappeared into the darkness, carrying the evidence, the police officers involved felt a sense of relief. They had done it. The plan had been put into practice perfectly. For them, the recordings were over, and the fear of being discovered and punished faded with the day that began. One of the policemen, relieved, looked at the head of the group and smiled sadly. "We're fine," he said, trying to feel better because he thought the worst was over. But even though they had destroyed the clearest evidence, they didn't know that there was still another silent witness. There was also another secret weapon that could change the situation. Samuel's house, the neighbor who helps the others, also had cameras. These cameras, placed in the right places, managed to record all the violence that the police were trying very hard to hide. Samuel, who up until that point had only been a bystander, had already decided that he would not remain silent in the face of this unjust situation. Inside the prison, Scott heard the news from his lawyer. The man who had always felt safe now seemed out of sorts. "They broke into your mother's house, Scott. The cameras were damaged." "The recordings are gone," said the lawyer. He spoke with a serious tone that Scott didn't usually hear. The room fell silent. Mary, who was sitting next to Scott, hardly had the strength to act. Her broken arm still hurt a lot. But the pain in her heart was what was making her suffer the most at the moment. She felt she could do nothing in the face of so much injustice. This seemed very difficult for her. Scott clenched his fists and took a deep breath. He had the impression that the ground was falling out from under him. Did you know that, without the recordings, the fight in court would be much more complicated? The photos clearly showed that his mother had been beaten for no reason. He was also injured by the police when he tried to defend her. Without them, it would be his word against the cops. Scott knew all too well how the system often didn't work well when it listened to people like him and his mother. Frustration was taking hold of him, but he couldn't let anger win. There was still a battle to fight, even if the odds seemed slim. Mary, her voice low but full of knowledge, looked at her son and said, "This isn't the first time they've tried to silence us, Scott. They've erased our truth before. You're stronger than that. We are here." His mother's words were a reminder of all the difficulties they had been through in life. Racism and injustice were already known to them. Even though it was a difficult time, Scott knew he couldn't stop fighting. His mind, which is always observant and thoughtful, began to look for other options. It wasn't right to let despair take over. Samuel is a man who is 53 years old. He had lived in the neighborhood for many years. He was reserved and had a quiet life, without many friendships with his neighbors. He had always been a person that nobody noticed, but now he was close to becoming something very important in discovering the truth. Samuel, unlike other people, never considered Mary to be a danger. He knew, perhaps better than anyone else there, the weight she bore without speaking. He watched the surrounding area carefully, but always paying attention. He didn't need to do big things to show that he cared. Just understanding in silence was enough. That's why, on the day Mary was viciously attacked by the police, Samuel saw everything from afar. His heart was filled with anger and sadness. That day, Samuel was at home. He was sitting at his window and could clearly see Mary's house. When he saw the policemen arriving aggressively, something inside him awoke. There was something wrong with the way they were acting. He couldn't believe his eyes. The officers were pushing Mary, a frail and defenseless elderly woman, to the ground. He realized how violent the officers were. He heard her screams of pain. The screams were so clear that it felt like he was right next to her. It was at that moment that Samuel decided he wasn't going to stand still. His house, like Mary's, also had security cameras. But unlike the cameras that looked after Mary, her cameras were in important places. They filmed the whole street. And by chance, or perhaps by fate, they had recorded every moment of the attack that Mary had experienced. Samuel knew what he had, the truth. He had clear proof that the police had done something wrong. That truth was kept in a safe place. That way, he was far away from the corrupt people who tried to hide what they had done. In the days that followed the assault, Samuel thought long and hard about what he should do. He knew that by taking part, he would be confronting not only the police, but also the racism that was present in the neighborhood. But at the same time, his mind was asking him to do something. He couldn't live knowing that he had proof that Mary was innocent and do nothing. Finally, he decided to look for Scott. Choosing wasn't simple. Samuel knew that people might be suspicious of his arrival. This was because he didn't have much contact with Mary and her family. But the truth he held in his hands encouraged him. He knew that without these recordings, Mary and Scott would be in a fragile situation in the face of a system that often fails to take care of those who are wronged. Samuel, very determined, prepared the recordings and made copies. That way, if anything happened to the material, the truth wouldn't be lost. Every image, every second of the video was there, stored on the cameras that recorded the abuses the police had committed. When Samuel decided to approach Scott, he did so slowly. The judge was very frustrated after the recordings from Mary's house were destroyed. Scott thought he had lost everything. When Samuel rang Scott's lawyer's doorbell carrying a USB stick with the recordings, it seemed that a new hope appeared. Scott looked sad. His eyes were tired and his face was serious. But when Samuel entered the room and started talking, he saw that something was about to change. "I live next door to you," Samuel said, in a calm but strong voice. "I watched what happened to your mother. And I have something you need to look at." He took the USB stick out of his pocket and gave it to Scott. The pressure in the room was strong. Scott, not really knowing what was going to happen, plugged the device into the computer. When the images began to rotate, what he saw made his eyes widen. Everything was there. Every movement, every act of aggression, every moment of the police's excessive use of force. Everything was there, in front of his eyes, stored in a way that could not be denied. The violence done to his mother, his attempt to help her, and the clear injustice, it was all there. Samuel looked on calmly as Scott saw those images. He understood that this was the proof he needed, the letter that would make the difference. Scott, with great emotion, looked at Samuel with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you," said Scott, his voice trailing off a little before becoming steady again. That's all we need to win." The presence of Samuel, the neighbor who had previously seemed like just someone looking on from afar, now became very important. Not only did he see what Mary and Scott had been through, but he also decided to do something to change the situation. With those photos in hand, Scott knew he could achieve justice. From that moment on, the game became different. The day came for the meeting to listen to the people. For Mary and Scott, that morning was full of nerves and anticipation. The journey there had been full of pain, shame, and inequality. But now, with the important evidence in hand, they knew that the outcome of the battle for justice was about to be decided. The room where the hearing took place in the center of the city was full of people. Reporters, lawyers, people from the community, and even some of Mary's neighbors had gathered to watch a case that promised to be very controversial. The police officers who had been accused of being too tough were there. They were sitting in neat rows. They tried to look like they were in control of the situation. But that day, there was something different about them. The arrogant manner that once showed confidence was now hidden. They looked nervous and made agitated gestures. They understood what was at stake. Scott entered the room with the decisive posture of a judge who has seen a lot, but feeling his heart squeezed like a sun. He was accompanied by his mother. Mary, despite her age and what she had been through, was still standing firm. Her arm was still frozen from the fracture. Tiredness showed on her face, but her dignity was firm. Every time she walked towards the witness box, the noise in the room increased. There was a strong tension in the room. People felt an expectation in the air. The judge who handled the hearing was a middle-aged man with a serious face. He had already looked at the case carefully. He understood that this wasn't just a situation of police violence. There was something more serious going on. It involved hidden racism and dishonesty within the police force itself. The room went completely quiet when the judge banged his gavel to start the proceedings. He looked at Scott and Mary. It showed that they could tell their story. When Scott stood to speak, everyone in the room went quiet. He, who had often been a judge, was now on the other side. He was fighting not only for his mother, but also for the justice of the system he believed in. His voice, although controlled and calm, had a lot of feeling. "We are here today to tell you not only what happened to my mother and me, but also to show you that the justice system, when it works properly, cannot be controlled or ruined," he began. Scott explained the case step by step. He recounted everything that happened from the arrival of the police at Mary's house to the physical abuse and the accusations that weren't true. He said that for no reason the officers treated his mother very violently. He tried to protect his mother and ended up being hurt too. But the main point of the presentation was still to come. When Scott spoke about the recordings that the officers themselves had destroyed, a commotion broke out in the room. The policemen who had been accused looked at each other nervously. They were clearly uncomfortable talking about what they had done. It was at this point that Scott showed the proof that leaves no doubt. He stood up slowly. Then he walked over to the table and showed the USB stick that contained Samuel's recordings. "Mr. Judge, even with the defendant's efforts to hide the evidence, we have clear proof that shows exactly what happened that day. These are the recordings made by a neighbor named Samuel. He saw and recorded all the violence that happened to my mother." The atmosphere in the room changed rapidly. The tension increased. Everyone was staring at the screen when the video started playing. The pictures taken by Samuel's cameras were clear and left no doubt. Mary was in her garden quietly watering the plants. Suddenly the police arrived and pushed her violently without explaining anything. The consequences of the fall, the broken arm, the cries of pain, everything was there, carefully noted down. The policemen, who used to do whatever they wanted without fear, were now in plain sight. The recording showed Scott arriving, very frightened, trying to protect his mother. He was grabbed hard and beaten even though he didn't struggle. The photos were a lot of evidence. The court, which had previously been very quiet, was now surprised. The police officers, who until now had thought they were safe, were now exposed to the truth they had tried to hide. The judge watched everything with a serious, emotionless face. He knew that those photos were very bad for the police officers' defense. When the video ended, the room fell completely silent. The truth was out, and there was no denying what everyone had just seen. The lawyer defending the officers tried, but with little success, to play down the importance of the images. However, his explanation seemed weak and clumsy in the face of the clarity of the evidence. Scott, who was still standing, looked at the judge. "These photos show what my mother and I went through because of those who promised to protect us. They reveal the reality that they tried to erase. We don't want revenge, but we want justice. Justice for an elderly woman who was treated like a thug. Justice for a son who was punished for trying to protect his mother. Justice for all the people who have already been silenced by a broken system." The judge paused for a moment before speaking. He looked around the room carefully. "The evidence that has been shown is clear and cannot be denied," he said, his voice strong. "The people who were supposed to help and protect did not fulfill their obligations. Even worse, they took advantage of the power they were given. This court cannot and will not accept that kind of behavior." With these words, the judge looked at the police officers who had been charged. They were afraid and didn't know what to say. The sentence was direct and firm. All the police officers who took part in the attack on Mary and Scott will have to pay compensation of $450,000. This amount is for the pain and trouble they caused them. The judge also ordered that the defendants be expelled from the police force immediately. He said that those who misuse power cannot be among those who take care of justice. At the end of the sentence, the police officers also received a 4-year closed prison sentence. This punishment served as a warning that no one, not even police officers, can be above the law. As they left the room with the help of guards, Mary, for the first time since it all began, felt that she had regained some of her strength. The pain in her body from her broken arm and the emotional problems were still there. But the invisible weight of injustice she felt was beginning to subside. She looked at Scott. Her eyes were tired but full of gratitude. They met his eyes. There was no need to say anything there. The silence between mother and son said it all. News of the trial spread quickly. In that wealthy neighborhood where racism and prejudice were often hidden by beautiful buildings and fake smiles, Mary's case made a big difference. Her neighbors, who had often ignored or even helped discriminate against her, now faced a difficult situation. Justice happened, and the prejudice that had previously gone unnoticed was revealed. Michelle, the neighbor who saw Mary's aggression and praised her, watched it all in silence. Now she feels guilt and regret. Michelle, who lives next door to Mary, had previously seen and praised the police violence. Now she was filled with regret. Mary falling to the ground and Scott being injured while trying to defend his mother stuck in his mind. She was there, seeing it all. Instead of helping or feeling sorry, she decided to support the violence. She believed in Mary's guilt just because of the color of her skin and because she was in that place. Michelle made a choice. The door opened slowly and Mary appeared. She had a frail body, but she was full of dignity. "I made a mistake. I witnessed what happened that day. Instead of helping her, I applauded. I did a very bad thing. I feel very sorry for that. I have no justification for what I did. I didn't know who she was, but I still made judgments. And not only that, I was happy with her pain. I don't know if I can really forgive you right now," Mary said sincerely, "but I think forgiveness is a process. For me, that process begins when you recognize that you've made a mistake. You can't change what has already happened. But you can change who you are going to be from now on." Michelle, overcome with emotion, began to cry. She knew she didn't deserve a quick pardon, but the fact that Mary was willing to consider it was more than she had hoped for. "Thank you," Michelle said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'll work hard to be a better person. I promise." After several weeks of confusion, difficult meetings, and Michelle's surprising apology, Mary and Scott's life finally seemed to be at a point where tranquility could happen. Scott decided that he would take his mother away from there. He wanted a place where the sea wind could help heal her pain. He dreamed of tranquil waters that could wipe away the bad memories and bring a little peace that they deserved. He decided to go to the Colombian Caribbean as the new place in their lives. This place is famous for its beautiful landscapes, transparent waters, and a sun that shines in a special way, warmer and more welcoming. When they arrived in the Caribbean, the warmth embraced them. The light breeze with the smell of the sea felt like a gift after weeks of stress. The view was beautiful. The sky was blue and endless. The sound of the waves crashing on the sand was soothing. The palm trees moved slowly with the wind. For Mary, it felt like she was entering a new place. This place made suffering seem like something she remembered from afar. It was like a sound from the past that she could now forget. For Mary, this new beginning wasn't just a change of place. Being in that place, away from the pain and injustices she had experienced, made her feel as if she were being reborn. She could take a deep breath. She didn't have the weight of always being judged for the color of her skin. She didn't have to deal with stares full of prejudice. The warm Caribbean waters were cleansing not only her tired body, but also her soul. They were taking away the sadness of the last few months and making room for something new. She was finding a peace she hadn't known could still exist.